The State of Azure with Scott Nichols.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host. Make sure to check out www.azuredevops.show for past episodes and show notes. And the goal of this podcast is to empower you and your teams with the information that you need to move fast and deliver consistent quality using the .NET ecosystem and to run your software systems with confidence in Azure. And for those of you running .NET and Azure user groups, I've been doing a lot of online video presentations. And if you run one of those user groups, I'd love to give a presentation for you. Our sponsor is my company, ClearMeasure, which is a software architecture company. And if your team needs some help doing more internally, please get in touch. And if you are a .NET developer and would like a path to become an architect, we are hiring. Just apply on the website, clearmeasure.com. 4 positions are open at the time of this recording. Today we have part 1 of a fascinating interview with one of the senior cloud architects at Microsoft. I have as the guest on today's show, Scott Nichols, and he's a senior cloud solutions architect at Microsoft. He works for the commercial enterprise division serving the West region, and he's also the .NET user group and Azure user group leader in Boise, Idaho. Scott, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, and I'm glad to be here. Welcome, audience.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn from you. In your role, you are deep in the bowels of Azure adoption for all kinds of software, helping large customers do that. But before we get into that, you are an architect. But what's your background? What are the key moments that kind of put you in the position you are now?
No, it's a great question. So yeah, because a cloud solution architect is kind of a new role. It hasn't been around very long, but yet I've been in IT for almost 30 years. So I started off as a software engineer in the early 90s. And then, my love for .NET when, I was a Java developer, C++, SQL. Then .NET came around. I started tinkering with that and absolutely fell in love. Well, I liked Java, going from the unmanaged to managed. And oh, this is great. Then .NET came around. I was like, wow, this is like a better Java. So that kind of started my journey. And the companies I happened to work for were always big Microsoft shops. There's always some Microsoft presence, in these companies. I've always worked for large corporations. And then from that, just going through the normal promotions, lead developer, became a solution architect, been a solution architect for probably 16 years, spent roles as a lead enterprise architect, but always really on the app and infra specialty because as a software engineer, a lot of architects have IT pro backgrounds. I did not. That is something I kind of got into later as a architect. You definitely got to pick up that networking stack and kind of vitally important, as well as databases. And then through my companies, when AWS came out, that was very intriguing as a user group leader. And when they came out with DynamoDB and their first platform services, they did put a .NET API out there. And of course, me and my user group people in Boise, Idaho, we were like, "Ooh, this is cool." So we started playing with that some 12 years ago, and that's what really got my journey started. At the time, before Microsoft had Azure, they were playing with the cloud, as we know AWS was first, and so I was an early adopter on Microsoft's cloud journeys before Azure existed. So I've been playing with Azure since day one, and then with my role for the various companies I've worked for. As an architect, the CTOs, CIOs say, "Hey, what's this cloud thing coming up?" And I said, "You know what? I see the writing on the wall." Kind of like when we saw VMware and these big and containerization. We see these big shifts in industry, right? I could definitely see this shift and say, "Okay, cloud is going to be a big thing." Not that managed data centers are new; they're not. It's just what the cloud offers, right? That whole managed plus the ecosystem of the development environment, right? How easy the cloud vendors made it for development groups, because I said, being a focus of developers, like, wow, now I don't have to wait 6 months for a database, or, I can literally turn on a service, use some code, and I can set up some infrastructure. So when I started seeing the possibilities, I started purposely tweaking my career, kind of diving into everything AWS, Azure, and then later GCP, kind of coming on top of that. And then really kind of became a cloud consultant. So before I joined Microsoft, that was my role. I kind of worked for large Fortune 100s, and they hired me as a cloud consultant, multi-cloud consultant, internal. And I would kind of argue with the AWSs, the Microsofts, or whoever. Because he's salesman, you can't trust him, right? You got to test everything they say. And then a few years ago, Microsoft made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna go jump over and go work for Microsoft. Instead of working for a couple companies, I'll support dozens, if not hundreds. So, and that's what I do now. And I definitely love my job at Microsoft. Get access to the product teams, which is awesome. Early access to bits, and get to see a ton of customers with a lot of their different scenarios. Every business is unique, but at the same time, every business is the same, right? They have the same problems, just in different industries, little bends. So yeah, no, it's very exciting work, and I definitely like the change that I made, and helping companies get into the cloud, understand cloud, and hybrid cloud. It's one of the distinction Microsoft really tries to say is, hey, we don't believe everything should be in the cloud. They're still on-prem databases. They're not going away. Microsoft still sells Windows servers, SQL servers, SharePoint servers. They still have, and they have a ton of edge devices now, which they didn't have in the past. These are dedicated hardware that is now meant to go into on-prem places to work in conjunction with cloud. So really exciting stuff there, especially in data and AI.
Yeah, you make a good point that everything is different, but everything is all the same.
Yeah. And the nice thing there is, so patterns and practices. We've got a lot of .NET people on here. That was one of my favorite teams at Microsoft. They did a lot of great stuff for .NET. The pattern practices team still exists, but now they report under Scott Guthrie on the Azure team, and they put together a ton of reference architecture. So as we work with customers, we see these patterns that we see over and over again. We basically create reference architectures, and we put them out there for companies to look at, all the way from network architectures, topologies, microservice patterns in the developer world. So basically now the nice thing is, when you partner with Microsoft and our consulting teams, or my teams that I work for, we've got a whole bunch of information that we can sit with companies and say, hey, let's look at what you've got, and we can give you some good guidance, because we've done this ourselves. Microsoft's obviously migrated to the cloud, hybrid cloud as well, and we've got thousands of customers that we've worked with. Because cloud is actually not that new anymore, right? It's over 10 years old, yet it's still pretty new for a lot of companies. Only about 30% of all the Fortune 500 is all there, but they're not all in yet. But there's still a ton of mid-sized, smaller companies still on that journey. And I'll say app modernizations with that as well. For .NET developers, like, hey, do we just spin up an IIS server in a SQL box? Or, well, now you've got all these platform services or SaaS services that you can really make some interesting type of applications in the cloud in minutes, and very cost effective. And that's one of the, just last week, Jeffrey, I was telling you, we had a internal meeting, and we were looking that there's still some 38, almost 40 million .NET apps that Microsoft's tracking out there that are active, right? They're pulling new .NET bits, upgrading their sites, which we can track that. But yet we only got about 1.5 million of them in Azure, right? So it's kind of our mantra now is like, hey teams, we got a lot of older .NET apps out there, and there's a lot of benefits if you just get those migrated over to Azure, both from a cost side, performance, and I'll call planet scale engineering, right? So the cloud gives you this ability to scale infinitely where you could never do on-prem.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we jump into more Azure stats, you mentioned reference architectures, and those are hard to find just with a Google search, or they get mixed up. Can you pinpoint us what's the best thing to search for to get those reference architectures that you spoke about? Because I think those are really valuable.
Yeah, if you look for, you can probably do Google search or Bing search, the Azure Architecture Center. That you should find that, and there's a new thing called the Cloud Adoption Framework, CAF, as we call it. If you search for those, that should get you into a link into the homepage of the reference architecture section. That is a big website when you get there. So yeah, definitely when you get into the reference cloud architecture site, there's a ton of links on the left. You can drill down there for a day. There's a lot of information there, a lot to read.
Okay. And so you've done work with AWS and Google Cloud as well as Azure, and yes, Amazon was first, and a lot of I guess the sexy web properties like Netflix have stories of how they built up on AWS and all that. I heard an announcement and some time ago that Azure surpassed AWS in amount of worldwide cloud capacity. And then, of course, the follow-on is like, okay, is it just a whole bunch of capacity? How much of the internet is Azure? What is the adoption? How does it compare these days?
Yeah, no. So I was certified in AWS as well as Azure, and probably weakest in Google GCP, but I can hold my own in the GCP cloud. To give credit where credit was due, like I said, I started in AWS. They've done an outstanding job. The platform is good. I mean, it's a good platform. Now, for size-wise, AWS definitely had the early adopter, competitive advantage, but Microsoft has done a great job in catching up, right? So stats change all the time, but argumentatively, I would say globally, as far as number of users in AWS or Azure is probably 2 to 1. So AWS still probably has, like I said, 2 to 1 for us. But if you look at AWS, they started on IaaS, infrastructure as a service. So they do have a massive IaaS footprint. Think of IaaS as just hosting VMware in the cloud, right? You're just taking your virtual machines and pushing them up there. Where Microsoft is above AWS is platform as a service. So if you platform as a service is where we've got those interesting services where you don't have to worry about the hardware. You're just saying, hey, I want a cache database. I want a database in the cloud. I want an app, some type of app service, and you just push your code to it. And it's all managed by Microsoft platform as a service. We have more instances of people using our platform as a service. And that makes sense because Microsoft started Azure on the platform side, not the infrastructure side. We had to play catch up with AWS because as it turned out, when cloud came out, PaaS was just ahead of its time. That was a little too aggressive back then. People couldn't get their heads around it. They're like, yeah, we understand VMware. Let's make that step. And it was a good payoff for AWS. And that's why they got the early lead. Today, Azure is growing at a quicker rate than AWS. So if you look at new subscribers and that's been a trend for about the last 3 years. So if you look every year, if you look at new people signing up, Microsoft is about a 2 to 1. But because AWS does have that early competitive advantage, it's going to take us a few years to catch up. At the end of the day, is Microsoft going to surpass AWS? I doubt it. I kind of predict in a few years there's going to be AWS and Azure. We're going to be close to each other in adoption. And then you got GCP, which is behind us as well. And they're desperately trying to hang on to that number 3 spot, but they're quite a ways behind both of us. And there are some reasons for that. So yeah, where do I see adoption? Fortune, of course, Microsoft, we're kind of dubbed the enterprise cloud. So you look at Microsoft's history, they work with companies, right? Windows servers are in almost every company in the world. Microsoft loves Linux now. They've kind of changed their tune on that. So if you look at the Fortune 500, we have like 99% of the Fortune 500, meaning they've got some Azure instance. Now, they're also AWS shops, so multi-cloud is definitely a big thing for a lot of reasons. But so Microsoft is growing very, very rapidly in the enterprise side of the world. I would say Silicon Valley, the startups. Google's probably got the biggest burst there. They tend to attract a lot of the startups. But then us at AWS, we get our fair share as well too. Now I will say, so .NET, we do have the most .NET. I will say for .NET people out there, there's a lot of reasons why I definitely promote .NET on Azure. If you're going to go to the cloud and you're a .NET SQL shop, it's just Azure is the cloud for you. You're going to have a lot less issues. It's going to be cheaper, period. And I will definitely argue that point because it's very even difficult to do .NET in Google. A little easier with .NET Core now. .NET Framework, just forget it. But we can go into some of the reasons why on the .NET side.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, Clear Measure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. Clear Measure, empowering software delivery.
We'll talk .NET just in general, even Azure or non-Azure.
Sure.
Because .NET is extremely popular. The audience here is .NET developers, regardless of how much on-premise, hybrid, Azure, whatnot. So help them understand what stats you're seeing as far as the breadth of .NET versus other major frameworks.
Yeah, so for one, .NET Core was a great idea. .NET Core, matter of fact, the .NET conference is going on right now, and I hope a lot of your listeners will jump on that and look at the recordings, and they'll give some of the latest statistics. But .NET Core is still one of the fastest growing frameworks out there, period. Obviously, putting it on Linux was a brilliant idea because it's gone off like gangbusters. And so Microsoft is still 100% behind .NET Framework and .NET Core. We got .NET 5 released, right? So that's the merging of .NET Core, Framework Core, and Xamarin, right? So we'll finally have this single environment to deal with. Thank goodness, been about time, right? So yeah, as far as a language, I pretty much the biggest languages I see in the cloud is Python, .NET. Of course, Java still has a healthy environment out there as well, but yeah, I definitely .NET is definitely still very vibrant. It's growing. We're seeing a lot of traditional Linux shops now starting to use it. One reason too is just the speed and performance, right? They start testing it, and it's pretty much the same speed as Go, right? Go is a very performant language from Google. So Microsoft's definitely put their sights high. And then as far as the integration, I think for the Azure side, unlike some of the other clouds, .NET is native to Azure, right? So when they create our cloud fabric layer, which is our API layer that controls all of Azure, and then everything's built on top of that, .NET is a first-party citizen. So every service has a .NET API. So that's not true for Google, that's not true for Amazon. The other thing is the other clouds are going to be years behind, where Microsoft's .NET team is right there with the service teams, right? So their APIs are tested day one, even before they go GA, which is general availability. And then we have a ton of platform services, which .NET was the first language, right? So SQL Server, Azure SQL Server, Azure App Services, those were started in .NET. So .NET's incredibly performant and well integrated. And then I got to talk about Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. Microsoft's tooling is incredible, especially with .NET, right? You can just hit a new project, your scaffolding's already right there, and then bam, you're plugged in. And yes, AWS has similar SDKs, but they are going to be way behind Microsoft, and they don't go nearly as deep. And I would say Visual Studio Code is probably one of the best ideas Microsoft had too. That's the number one development environment us cloud developers work in today. Very quick, rapid, and .NET works outstanding, as well as JavaScript. I see a ton of JavaScript developers using Visual Studio Code.
Okay. I saw a stat that 31% of the entire internet is .NET. Is that true, or is that only in certain situations?
No, that was, yes, that was one of our product marketing managers. Mike selected Microsoft's tracking, and according to the latest tracking, over 30% of the internet is some form of .NET. So that'd be Framework, Core, and even Xamarin is included in that.
That's huge. That
is huge. That's we're definitely surpassing some of the other. Like I said, I think we're seeing a decline in Java, but like I said, Python is probably the next biggest other. When I tell developers languages they really should probably learn, is like, you know what, you probably want, if you're going to work for a big company, you really want to learn .NET. You might want to have Python in your backpack, and obviously JavaScript or TypeScript, right? Got to have that. And those are kind of the three. And then of course, some SQL. Understand some type of SQL dialect. You really can't develop an app without some type of data store.
Right. Now you're helping commercial customers to modernize their .NET apps so that they can run in Azure. Is there a formula or just a generic process that you've followed on? Like you mentioned, everything's different, but everything's the same.
Yeah.
Is there an 80-20, like 80% of the time you just do it this way or follow this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you think, okay, hey, some team might have an app on-prem and So what do I mean? What does a cloud architect mean when we say, hey, we're going to modernize your app? The question, if there is from an architecture perspective, is microservices, right? So when you go into the cloud, so Jeffrey, have you heard the concept of cattle?
Yep, cattle versus pets versus chickens.
Yes. So in the cloud, because there's so many platform services, and even the IaaS services can be disconnected, can be spun up and spun down. You don't want pets in the cloud, right? So on-prem, you might have a server, hey, we'll call it Hercules or Ben.
And you'll have to define a pet for the listeners who haven't.
So when we say a pet, so let's say in on-prem, you probably have name servers, they got these cool names, but you have some IT pro who babies that server, right? They patch it, they do whatever, it never goes down. That's a pet. In the cloud, we discourage that type of architecture because the cloud is elastic, meaning you're going to have everything's going to be behind a load balancer, and you're going to have one server now, but then when you hit it with twice the load, 10 more servers are going to spin up. So with this, that's the cattle mindset, right? So hey, everything is a piece of cattle. We're going to have 10, then we're going to have 20, then we're going to slaughter half of them. They're going to go away. So we have to architect our infrastructure to scale very rapidly. So we can't have these babied servers that you watch, right? Because servers are now just a compute instance. It's going to spin up for 10 minutes, run your job, and it's going to go away. So that's probably the big side, is working with IT pro side, teaching them, hey, we've really got to start getting you into scaling architectures, because that's one thing the cloud gives you, is that's the elastic scalability on demand, and you pay for what you use at the time you use it. That's the benefit of the cloud. Because you can definitely spend more money in the cloud than on-prem if you're not being smart about it. And that's part of our jobs as cloud architects. Hey, if you're doing the cloud properly, you actually should save money. You don't have to, it's not guaranteed, because you could do some other cool things, but you should. And then once we can get you to that level set point where, hey, we can retool your applications to scale. You're developing apps that are stateless. You're trying them. You do have state. Okay, we have to make state servers, right? And these servers have to be able to scale. So we have to redesign all of your apps where everything can be scalable on demand, and we can go what we call that planet scale engineering. So, and here's the thing: all of us have built apps. Let's say you had 1,000 users, right? You built an app, 1,000 users hit, and then you get bought by another company, and all of a sudden now you got 1 million users hitting your app, but your app can't scale, right? It just crushes. But the cloud architecture, we don't care if it's 1 user or 1 million users. The app should be able to scale on the infrastructure side automatically. So that's what we work with developer teams and infrastructure teams. Say, hey, you no longer have to rewrite your app for scalability. We're going to design your app to where if 1 user is running it or 1 million users, this thing will be just fine. And that means from an architecture, like you guys are probably message buses and queuing technology. Because if you can think about it, what's the number one thing that typically crashes, right? It's the database. Mm-hmm. You develop an application, you get a lot of, the front end web servers are easy to horizontally scale. Databases are very difficult to auto scale, right? So we always have to protect those databases. So, okay, architects get in there and say, okay, we have to protect the database. So let's do some type of caching and queuing layers and things like that. So those are microservice patterns that we endorse. And some of these patterns are very old. They're not new, right? If you look at some of these patterns, they've been around forever. We're just now saying they're really important for the cloud, and we pretty much force them upon people and say, hey, I know you don't want these extra pieces in here, but if you're going to put your app out there and you don't want to re-architect this in 3 years, just add this caching tier in, or add this message queue so we can schedule the data. Or we have this function app now that can scale on demand. So that's really what the modernization is about. It's helping people say, hey, how do we, and then decoupling, right? So the monolithic world, we had a 3-tiered environment, right? Before, our app servers, your middle tier servers, your data tier, and then maybe some reporting or BI type tier. And they were very tightly coupled. So that would hurt when there was a major upgrade. You would have to rewrite big parts of the system. So when you think microservices, you just say, hey, let's encapsulate pieces. So teams, it doesn't matter what language you're in. They're working through APIs, disjoint or very cohesive APIs that everyone understands. And then all the way down to the data tier, right? The data persistence tier. So in that microservice, that one team can upgrade the order form system without affecting anyone else. And that's another principle of the cloud that we really try to help development teams on is, hey, we really want to try to decouple your applications. And you can get into microservice hell, just like DLL hell and everything else. You can go too far. But we try to understand where this company is going or what this app needs to do, and just say, hey, once you can get this thing segregated out a little bit, your upgrade cycles and your CI/CD deployment cycles are going to be a lot easier because you're not so tightly coupled, even though your architecture overall is more complicated. Thus, if you guys look for job positions, why are there so many solution architect jobs now? And one of the main issues is because apps are getting more complicated. Engineering-wise, they're more complicated. As you go down these microservice patterns, you need people that their job is to make sure they understand what pieces are bolted to what, and that's the solution architect's job. That's the reason there's so many solution architects out there now. Is as you decouple apps, it does. That's one of the cons of a microservice architecture. It's engineering-wise, it's more complicated. There's more moving parts, but your upgrade cycle should be more performant. Your CI/CDs will be a lot easier. Your app life cycle is going to live many more years, right? Because you can get more traction out of that app because it is so disconnected.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, with the Azure infrastructure, and maybe there's some differences, we have the ARM templates, and then there's Terraform for infrastructure as code. But from where you sit, what is the state of the art when it comes to infrastructure as code, and what falls into place nicely now versus doesn't?
Yeah, so you mentioned we call it ARM. So that's called the Azure Resource Manager template. So everything in Azure, when you create your infrastructure, is basically there's a config file, and it's a JSON file. That's all ARM is. ARM is basically a big JSON file that has all the configuration that's documenting the state of your infrastructure. So one of the things that we help teams is we're big on CI/CD, right? DevOps. So DevOps, the whole DevOps trend is definitely actually heightening, because one of the things with the cloud, for security reasons, I'll back up a little bit. Cloud is very secure. And actually, most Gartner will actually argue now that cloud is more secure than on-prem, just because of what, you think about it, AWS, Microsoft, Google, we're hiring the best security experts in the world. Nobody can even touch us. And then the investment they put in. And to date, to all big three clouds benefit, there have been no public breakthroughs through any of the big clouds. And we all cheer each other, because if it happens, we're all going to pay the price, right? So security is always top notch. There's several layers of defenses that we put in on your behalf. So, and even if you're doing something stupid, the security center in Azure is going to have big red flags and come and say, hey, idiot, you got an open port. You better go close it. So we're doing a lot of advanced AI to tell your IT pros and developers they're doing bad things and give them recommendations. We even have a concept called red team, blue teams. These are professional hackers and defenders. We have thousands of them, and they actually try to penetrate our enterprise accounts all the time. And if they find a vulnerability, they'll push that back into the field, and we'll tell our customers, hey, one of our professional hacking groups just found a vulnerability. So most companies can't afford to hire professional hackers to just hack around. So we do that. So back to the security piece. With the cloud, security is a joint effort. You have to take that in mind from day one. And where was my thought train going to go with that? So you have to, so I guess that's probably the biggest change too, is when you think of security on-premise, security was always an afterthought. With the cloud, it's baked in. So when we start our cloud journey, we're looking at our infrastructure, we're designing our security layers in from the very beginning. We're making sure there's a security guy on the team. On the Agile team, there's actually a security guy sitting with the developers from day one. So that's probably a big distinction when we're doing cloud development. Now with ARM templates, well, that's where I was going with that. So to make it secure, if your infrastructure is all defined by software code, well, that software code can be checked into your source control, right? So now you can put your deployments behind source control. So you can have pull requests, you can have people, you can have security people looking at that. So your infrastructure can change dynamically, but it still has to go through all that rigorous source control review that the software industry has been using for years, right? So that's probably the biggest change that I spend most of my time with, is educating IT pros how to be developers. And I'll actually steal a term from Google. I'll give them some credit. The vice president of cloud at Google says everyone is now a software engineer. IT pros hate to hear that, but that is the truth today, is whether you're writing a web app or you're writing infrastructure as code in a Terraform template or an ARM template, it doesn't matter. Everyone is writing code now. Everyone's checking code into a source control wall. Everyone's doing a pull request. So it doesn't matter what you're doing now. Everything is code. So that's probably the biggest benefit of the cloud is now. And then for software engineers, at least the lead engineers, right? The more senior developers, they have to start looking beyond just the code of the app. Or you have an SRE team, site reliability engineering, or a DevOps team that they have to learn that infrastructure, right? Because when you're building an app now, you're writing code that's actually spinning up the VM, spinning up the queuing server, spinning up the messaging bus, and they have to and then the networking, how it talks. And so we're seeing this breakdown of disciplines and these new DevOps engineers / SRE engineers that are now those old IT pros or developers who kind of like that hardware side, and that's that kind of sweet spot, where they meet and they control that environment that gets spun up.
This interview continues next episode. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.